So this is session 4 of How Jesus Changed the World, and today's subject may sound a little bit odd, but Christianity was largely responsible for bringing in education for all. Some time ago, a church school ran into financial difficulties and had to close, and I remember a radio commentator making the remark, the church should keep its nose out of education. I was tempted to ring in and say, do you realise that it was the church who brought about education for everyone, and it was the state that finally took over? Because education used to be for the elite, the wealthy, and basically they would have private tutors for their children. The only race of people who did educate their basic education for children were the Jews. Every child, and that included girls, would be taught to read and write. But mostly around the world, if you're in a trade, agriculture, or later in history working in factories, you didn't have an education. The first university was set up in Rome by the Pope, and it was for training clergy. And then a little bit later, they would allow wealthy children to enrol because they would be trained as diplomats and things like that. The Augustinian monasteries began to educate their monks because they saw that the mind was a gift of God and it was important to improve the mind. But again, it wasn't the ordinary person who had access to this education. When you go to Europe, you'll see the wonderful frescoes in churches and the beautiful windows depicting biblical scenes. And the reason they were done was because the basic person couldn't read. And so this was a way of teaching them the Bible stories. It was Martin Luther in the 1500s who came to understand the concept of the priesthood of all believers. And that simply means that every believer had the task of representing God to the rest of the people. And he thought, well, if people are to be priesthood to the rest of the world, they need to know what it's all about. They need to be educated. And so this was the beginning of educating the ordinary person in Europe. In England, it began in the 1700s, when it was the Industrial Revolution and people were crowding into the cities, working in factories 6 days a week. There was a man called Robert Raikes. He was a Christian man, and he saw that on Sunday there were large groups of young people who were just milling around, not knowing what to do with themselves. And he felt these people need a chance to better themselves. And so he began what they called Sunday schools. Now, it simply wasn't a religious education, it was school on Sunday. And they were taught to read and write. And certainly the Bible was basically the text that they had to use, but it was to give these people a basic education. By the end of the 18th century, there was something like 16 million children in these Sunday schools. It was in the 1870s that the state finally took over and provided education for all. Now, why was education so important to Christianity? It was that principle that Martin Luther saw. People needed to be able to understand the faith, understand the Bible, if they were to represent God to other people. But it's also that notion of equality. Everybody needs to have the same chance in life. And we know now that education is absolutely vital to enable somebody to achieve their potential. And I guess the church still has that challenge today, even in Australia, to see that the poorest and the most disadvantaged have the same chance at education as everyone else does.